Ставлю дуже цікавого наступного спікера Juttу Sommerbauer, яка працює на видання Die Presse, австрійське видання. І я не буду дуже довго розказувати про якісь біографічні речі, скажу тільки один момент, щоб ви зрозуміли, наскільки важливого спікера ми зараз маємо. Я коли був у Відні на дебатах з приводу пропаганди, які проводила Die Presse, якраз це було 2 роки тому, і це було в Віденській дипломатичній академії. Тоді багато людей до мене підходило і запитували, чи я знаю Ютту, тому що це основна людина, якщо ви хочете дізнатися, як австрійські медіа висвітлюють події в Україні, то це перша людина, з якою потрібно говорити. І це досить цікаве представлення. І я передаю вам слово.
Дякую. Yeah, of course there are many other people in Austria who are well informed about Ukraine, many other journalists. Thank you for the compliments and thank you for this nice presentation. Actually, as you can see, as Yevgen already said, I'm a journalist in Austria. I work for this daily newspaper, Die Presse. And actually I feel a bit awkward to have this presentation after ISIS propaganda and Russian propaganda, because my presentation, as you will see, will be a bit different. And actually I think it's a bit more connected to the presentations that we had yesterday. The topics or the issues we discussed about media and ethics, and the questions that were raised, such as whether professional standards and media ethics are applicable in the ongoing armed conflict, like the one in Donbass. So I will try to shed light also on these issues, also on some of the questions that were raised yesterday by Andri, and will present you my take on that. And my presentation will be very much hands-on, also coming from the perspective of a foreign or from international reporter in Ukraine. Okay. So actually what I would like to start with is a brief discussion of how international media covered the war in eastern Ukraine, our own conditions of reporting, so to speak. And then I will go on further. Well, as some of you might be aware of, most international media outlets do not have a bureau or staff reporters based in Ukraine. So at the heat of the crisis in 2014, many international news organizations collaborated with freelancers in Ukraine who moved to the country during the conflict or were based here prior to the Euromaidan anyway. Most journalists, international journalists, however, were sent by their outlets, so-called parachute reporters, who stayed for a couple of days, maybe for a week. This is also how I covered the events. I would stay in the country for a maximum of maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and then flying out and going back and forth, maybe coming every 6-7 weeks. So when the crisis broke out in late 2013, no Austrian media had a permanent correspondent in Ukraine. As in many other countries, Ukraine is usually covered from Moscow or from Warsaw or from the desk in Vienna. And it's maybe interesting to know that only in September 2015 the Austrian public broadcaster ORF opened a representation in Kiev, which is now headed by Christian Verschütz. Some of you might know him. This is a Austrian war reporter who kind of got famous in my country in the Balkan Wars, and who actually spent most of his time in Donetsk staying at the Donbass Palace, which would raise questions for us as to how much money our public broadcaster actually has. A lot, obviously. So whereas bigger international media outlets sent their own correspondents or collaborated with freelancers, actually this didn't happen so much in my country, except for ORF. And the situation is quite similar and maybe a little bit better in Germany, which actually means that most of the articles that we published were written from the desk in Vienna, and like in my newspaper, if it was not me traveling to the country, we mostly relied on agency reports. This situation, the desk reporting, is quite typical nowadays, I would say, for foreign coverage in mainstream Western media, except for the really big ones and the really well-known ones, such as New York Times and the likes. And unfortunately, this situation doesn't concern only Ukraine, and it's, of course, due mainly to economic constraints in our business nowadays. But this also means, for reporting, this also means that you rarely break a story. Actually, you rather tend to follow what is published by others, in a way also follow the hype. Yeah, another observation. During Maidan and when fighting erupted in the east, the papers were full, of course. But after the big battles in Donbass were over, we're now lacking a continuous coverage, and the interest has declined sharply. Just some data to illustrate that. I mean, this is not like a scientific. This is not like big science what I'm presenting now. I just looked up how often we mentioned the term Ukraine in die Presse, and whereas in 2014 we had more than 2,000 actually times mentioned in the country, the year in 2015 it was only around 1,000 times, and I think in 2016 it will be even less. So I think the Austrian picture is quite in line with the international trend. Well, by now most correspondents and most freelancers have left Ukraine. As a big news story, it is over. Ukraine is not so much about exceptional events anymore. What is happening now are lengthy, very complicated processes, the kind of one step forward, two steps back story that is very difficult, or rather difficult, to explain to the international audience. Stories like which direction the reform process is taking, or how heavyweights are regaining influence in the country, party politics and infighting in the ruling elite, economic and social crisis, are much harder to sell than distinct events. All these events are not so spectacular anymore, and of course they are much more complicated to cover. If you, as a foreign journalist, don't follow closely what is happening in Ukraine, you easily lose track. And I think this is what we see, and this is what is happening right now. Well, in retrospect, the way how international media have reported on Ukraine, I would say, was along two main lines. Probably you could call this a narrative or a meta-narrative, according to which journalists, and I'm talking about, again, international journalists, pitch their stories. In a way, we kind of needed to frame our stories for an audience that is not very familiar with your country. On the one side, it was mainstream media who talked mostly, of course, about the struggle for freedom, story, and whereas the so-called, fascist junta took control story was of course mainly covered in fringe media or in kind of leftist and right-wing newspapers. Let's talk about the first narrative, because it seems to be more interesting in our case, and of course also closer to reality. Indeed, many journalists felt sympathetic with the Ukrainian people when Maidan first happened, and when they saw how Russia annexed Crimea overnight, and how the armed uprising in the east was instigated. But now, with time passing, I think that also this narrative is somehow crumbling and losing its appeal. There's just this growing sense of a kind of post-revolutionary stagnation, I would say. And also, looking back, I would say that this, the way we presented stories to the audience has at times prevented us from looking at some more problematic aspects or developments that didn't quite fit into the main story. Ukraine is changing, and right now, unfortunately, not for the better. Especially when you look at the government level, I think that it was referred to yesterday. I don't remember who it was, but there was this gap that it has been described between the old elite and the new society, or the society who wants more. Now there seems to be no clear narrative, where the Ukraine story could fit into. On the one hand, I think this might be an advantage, as it opens up space and reporters will just have to examine topics and stories more thoroughly and pursue their own stories that they find important. One more aspect. What does the decreased international attention might mean for local colleagues? I think it might mean, but we can discuss this later, of course, that it will be again more difficult for Ukrainian journalists to continue with their brave reporting. International media attention and reports about thorny issues have made it somehow easier, I think, for national journalists to pursue also difficult stories. And from my experience, I can say that when I was in the East, there were many Ukrainian colleagues teaming up with their international colleagues, and I think they also, in many cases, profited from the experience of senior correspondents or experienced war reporters. So now I would like to discuss some of the. I'm not going to focus so much on propaganda really, because I think there are better experts for that here. But I'm also in the discussion. I'm of course willing to reply to your comments and questions on propaganda. But I would rather like to use this presentation here to mention some of the blind spots of recent conflict reporting and possibly what to learn from it. So there are some questions I would like to tackle, like should journalists go to the other side, and should journalists give space to the enemy in their reports? When are journalists being instrumentalized? Are there topics we should not report on? I would like to start with this Mirotvorets case, and I should say I'm myself on this list, so it's kind of an interesting situation for me right now. But I should also say that I'm not concerned primarily for my own safety. I think what this case illustrates is that press freedom and serious conflict reporting is under attack in Ukraine. The publication and also the reaction of politicians, some of them who kind of openly defended the leak, has created an atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust, I believe. Although many international journalists are also affected by this list. I think this is and will predominantly be a problem for local journalists in Ukraine. Why? Because it is them who have to cope with this restrictive situation and a distorted understanding of what the role of the media is in a democratic society, and also what the meaning of the independence of media means. And I'm also afraid that more restrictions in the legal field are to come, actually. Well, by naming and shaming journalists, Mirotvorec is setting new boundaries of what is acceptable and what not, and it also suggests complicity of journalists who went to the DNR. And so I think the message clearly is a good journalist doesn't go to the enemy side. So I think it ultimately aims to tighten control over the information sphere. I'd like to add also my take on this journalist and or citizen dilemma. Of course, this discussion is not a new one, and I think it comes up in all countries with conflicts or unresolved conflicts. And although Andri yesterday was a bit skeptical, I felt, about the issue of international exchange on this and how other journalists in conflict zones have handled the issue. I think that it might sense to do this because there might clearly be some examples where you can learn from, or at least compare, or at least not feel alone with all these questions. So when the crisis started, of course many journalists felt that journalism wasn't enough, so they became activists and volunteers and patriotic commentators on Facebook. And while it is clear that every one of us has views and beliefs and opinion, and there is nothing wrong with it, it is also, we are not like 100% objective or totally biased, and we are no robots. But I think for me the main difference and what is important to point out is, of course, as an activist, you're trying to change a given situation. And as a reporter, your main task is to inform about the situation. You pass on information as truthfully as you can, and you tell stories. So reporting is not about social change in the first place. This may happen later as a consequence. And no wonder, of course, that as reporters we often feel helpless, or especially in times of crisis. I think the trouble starts when we start ignoring professional standards because they don't fit into the story we would like to tell or sell. And the way I see professional standards actually is more like guiding principles that guide us, not so much that there is an abstract truth out there which we should find, but more when we cover events and tell stories, I think it means asking ourselves, maybe am I too involved to tell this story? Am I being fair to my interview partners? In a given case, do I need to protect sources, or is the need of the public to know everything bigger? Am I being transparent also about my own position? And I think it's very interesting what we can now see in Western media very often is this form of a journalistic form of the making of a story, which is kind of gives more transparency or illustrates better how a story was being done, and also which kind of deals with the role of the reporter and his or her interests. So I think this might be a way of coming to terms with this dilemma, or one of the ways. I think in Ukraine there are stories that don't get covered, or don't get covered as much as they would deserve it. because of fear that it might damage the image of the country, or that it might be picked up by Russian state media, or that journalists would find themselves in the position of Putin's useful idiots. So, but being able to publish critical, at times uncomfortable stories is of course one of the major differences between Ukraine and these separatist territories. And I'm personally confident, maybe you could call this naive maybe, but I'm confident that on the long run press freedom and independent media will strengthen Ukraine. I think by covering up issues and by not reporting, we're doing society no favor. Of course, the country needs fearless editors who are ready to publish controversial stories. And yes, I'm also sure that there are many here. And what was, for example, for me, like personally an interesting example of how to deal with a controversial story was this report on the Maidan protester who shot 2 Berkut police officers, like this documentary that was done by Hromadske. So I think the way they did it was a good way. They published the story, they didn't disguise it, but in a way they also explained his motivation, and they also discussed, I mean, it was clear that they are aware of the sensitivity of these revelations in the current context. Yeah. So some more comments on blind spots. I think reporting on the war has in large parts focused on the war as such, like especially the national coverage. How are the soldiers doing? Do they get supplies in time? What's happening on the front line? Are the positions moving? Who is taking which position, and so on. So that is of course the daily business and also the nucleus of traditional war reporting. However, again, I think there are things that have been, where not enough attention was being paid to, that the things that are underreported. Mostly the human cost of the war and the aftermath of the conflict, like displacement and trauma, domestic violence, and long-term social and economic consequences. I am convinced that it is background reporting, analysis, and also the storytelling approach, so fact-based narrative journalism that is going beyond the news story, that enables the audience to really understand what is going on, and as a consequence also might help society to come to terms with the situation. Reporting on conflict, the way I see it, is not just about looking at fighting and tensions and maybe even fueling them through coverage, but also to provide an insight why a conflict escalated, who the stakeholders are, what their interests are, and also possibly to investigate how a conflict could be solved. Just like the war and the frontline have divided communities, journalists also tend to pick up one standpoint, like it's us and them. What I noticed when reading Ukrainian reports on communities in the East is the following. Very often the communities or people who live in Donbas region or close to the front line are portrayed in relation to their position on patriotism and national belonging. And sometimes it even seems like a journalist is wandering around and asking people, you know, the one important question, are you for or against Ukraine? Are you supporting us or the separatists? And in some of these reports you can really feel the frustration of the journalists, because there's this feel, after all, they're against us. So But I think there is little insight that we get from these reports as a reader. Plus, journalists are not judges. And I think one way out might be, instead of focusing so much on positions and slogans, maybe we should try more to shed lights on interests and needs, even if we don't support them personally. I mean, what I'm talking about is also grounded in my own experience and grounded in my own frustration, kind of covering the war in Donbass. So at the beginning, I spent a lot of time at the Oblastna Administracja, OGA, and I would talk with all the protesters there, and they would shout at me, and you know, I would hear all these slogans, and I would feel really, at times angry, at times tired, at times frustrated. And then in summer, some months later, I would go to places that had been shelled, and of course there you meet people in despair, people who are in very difficult psychologically conditions. And again, I don't know, for me this kind of reporting, I felt like I'm stuck. So I was trying to find ways to look at these stories in a different way. And what I personally did, I just started to spend more time with people. Like for example, families who live on the front line, and kind of immerse in their lives, and let me tell them the story from their point of view. And after some time, people really will tell you more about their needs and expectations, and you get to hear much more than these typical slogans that we all know. And in a way, I found this really liberating for me as a journalist, because it's also a kind of change in perspective, going away from this victim's position or perpetrator position to individuals. And still, of course, when you meet people, there might be many things that you don't agree with them on. And actually, in these kind of long-form articles, I think there is also a way of dealing with your own standpoint and letting this also, bringing your position in. And in these stories, the war still plays a big role, but maybe not a defining role as such. Just another example, also to make this clear. I'm sure every one of you, or nearly every one of you, has heard about this hotspot Zaitsewe, the town that is really on the front line and that is split by the front line, and where people on one side live on the territory controlled by Ukraine, and on the other side on the territory controlled by the separatists. And of course, in Ukrainian media, there have been stories on Zaitsewe, about the Ukrainian part, so to speak. And ironically, you could do the same story on the other side of Zaitsewe, because the situation is quite similar. But also with these kind of frontline stories, I think media also tend to duplicate the existence of the frontline and the separations. So maybe an alternative approach would be to tell the story how the war has affected both sides, because indeed it has, and it has split a community that just used to live together. And there are victims and human grief on both sides. So I'm talking now about civilians, civilian population. Okay, some more words on access. In Ukraine, for a long time, the war zone was somehow easy to reach, so paperwork was mainly demanded from the Ukrainian side, actually. You needed this ATO card and a permit. And this has changed since last summer, when the separatists introduced a strict control prior to entry, and they also started to deny access to journalists. well, as many of you are aware of, for Ukrainian journalists it is quite dangerous, and at times it has been life-threatening, especially in the beginning of the conflict, to go to the other side. But I still know a handful of colleagues who have managed to do this and who actually still do this. So the control and also the increasing bureaucracy is unfortunate for journalists, and I think it is still vital to demand access. If you ask me personally, can and should international journalists report from there? I would say yes, of course. And can and should a Ukrainian national report from there? Yes, if you feel confident and if you want to do this, if you take security precautions, and maybe it's best to go with an international colleague. And yeah, I honor my Ukrainian colleagues very much who go there and did all this important work. I would like to expand on this a little, because I think it's here not always accepted why you should be on both sides, and you know what's the purpose and what do we gain from this. As reporters, I believe we talk to both parties of the conflict. This is our job. This is journalism. But in the course also of this Mirotvorets affair, people have claimed that going to the other side was a Ukrainian phenomenon, and that this would not happen in other conflicts. But I mean, they are wrong. Just look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's this very controversial reporter, Amira Haas, who is an Israeli national and Jewish, who reports who reported in the past from the West Bank and from the Gaza Strip. And of course, there is Anna Politkovskaya, a Russian, who covered the war from the Chechen side. And I just recently talked with my friends from Serbia, and I asked, she used to be a war reporter, and I asked her, did you cover the conflict from different sides? And she told me, yes, of course, we went there. Even also, you know, locals who reported for national media, they would go to all the different republics. And she said that her biggest problem was actually with her own people, because they would consider her a traitor. So many ask, why go? Because anyway, there is only propaganda over there and you cannot move freely. Well, it is of course true that the separatist regimes have installed some kind of control of journalists, as I told you. First and foremost, you need this accreditation, and they are also trying to be more professional, I believe, in a way. So they have this press service, and of course every so-called minister has a spokesperson, and they also try to get in contact with international journalists. But I think, anyway, it always depends on you, on the individual journalist. Of course, your task is not to follow the propaganda, but to expose it. And even by interviewing officials, it often becomes self-evident that they're talking nonsense. Like, this happens very often in the DNR, but it also can happen in Kiev sometimes. I mean, officials talking nonsense. So, yeah. And anyway, if you don't want, or if you cannot go physically, I think it is still important to try to access as many trustworthy sources and contacts as possible, also behind the line. There is really an information vacuum when it comes to Donbass, as to the separatist territories. Today, while most of the information we get is from official sources, from the other side, which means controlled DNR, LDNR media, so-called media, daily briefings by the army, and of course there are some underground bloggers or video bloggers or citizen journalists who post stuff on social media. But again, I think also this social media material has to be handled with care and shouldn't be taken as face value. Bloggers don't have a code of conduct. So coming to an end, lessons learned, this sounds very American. Which stories are important from my point of view again? I think in times of conflict, in times of war, investigations and thorough analysis, follow-up stories are really important. There's so many things that are happening at once, and many stories tend to kind of get out of sight. So I think it often makes sense to go back to stories and ask what has really happened. Also to investigate rumors. Maybe you remember this piece that Natalia Antelava did for the BBC. There were these rumors about a girl that had been allegedly killed in a shelling, and she found out that there was no such a girl. So it makes sense to go after rumors. Going back to places to see what happened, how a story developed. And of course, it's always important to fact-checking and numbers, as both parties try to cheat with numbers. When reporting on political strategies, for example, Kiev's Donbass strategy, what to do with the occupied territories, or the peace talks in Minsk, instead of just reiterating statements and positions, I think it makes much more sense to do a thorough conflict analysis, the players and their respective stakes, who gains from the conflict, what will happen if, and so on. And then, as I already mentioned, there's this human or humanitarian angle, people on the ground, which is usually neglected in times of a violent crisis, although the majority of the victims are civilians. And they are mostly affected by this war. So it's a war in a densely populated area, infrastructure is destroyed, mines, freedom of movement issues, healthcare issues, access to state services, all these things. And most of these issues are actually shared problems by people on both sides. So, as I pointed out in this Zaitsev example, And then maybe the last thing I would like to mention, of course, this whole complex of questions that's related to the consequences of the conflict, how it has changed society, how the conflict has affected education and memory culture, consumer culture, intellectual life, social issues, or the fabric of families. I don't know how this sounds to an Ukrainian audience, but international colleagues of mine, they have, maybe you have also done these stories, I don't know, but international colleagues of mine, they have visited frontline farmers. So it's not so much about of what they think about the war, but how they make a living, and how to keep a business in the conflict zone. And what is also, or what I find interesting to do as from a journalistic perspective, of course, is portraits of people who change things on the ground. Well, usually we give space to people who instigate conflicts, like rebel commanders or soldiers, politicians. But it is, I think, equally legitimate to write about people who help de-escalating tensions, call them peacemakers or whatever you like. And we don't hear about them so much. I think I'm going to stop here with these examples. I would be really interested also to know what you think about this, if you think that's, I don't know, naive or apolitical, whatever. So, and I'm ready to answer your questions and comments.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. It actually, I feel it's a very right place, and so at the beginning you mentioned that probably it was a better topic for yesterday, but actually what you framed greatly that's where the journalism stops and something else starts, and you did it through examining journalistic practices, which is also very important, because if journalists follow standards and practices, very often it keeps them from crossing the thin red line from journalists to someone else. And it's great you mentioned the miratorious controversy, because this is one of the biggest topics right now, and I think we would also elaborate a little bit on this later as well. I would just jump in on what you just said. You mentioned Amira Khas, and it's a very interesting case because basically she not only was reporting from territories, but she also denounced Israel basically and called it apartheid state, and you cannot find more controversial journalists within Israel because of this. I'm not sure this is the best example to bring it to Ukrainian journalists, how they should cover, because again, it brought her to the other extremity of the spectrum, from not covering one side, but just to moving to another side. It's like any Ukrainian journalist would go to so-called Ordlo and
take DNR citizenship.
Yeah, and would claim citizenship over there. Yeah. Yeah. And now we're going to questions, and Yulia has the first one.
Jutta, thank you so much. Could you name a Russian reporter working in the Donbass war zone whose work would meet the standards you mentioned? Just interested in it. And which of the Western reporters has done the greatest job? I know it's good, maybe probably it's not a good idea to judge your colleagues, but still.
Yeah.
Since your Russian is perfect, we've read all that stuff, I'm sure.
Yeah. Not so perfect, but I can still read it. So, of course, the person I'm going to name is again an exception in the Russian media landscape. I mean, I'm aware of that, but I think that, for example, the reporting of Pavel Konygin is very good and adheres to standards, and actually he also did a lot of interesting investigations and interviews that was also that were very useful also for Ukrainian colleagues, I believe, and for many others. And well, concerning Western journalists, I believe there are many. I mean, I should just maybe also mention. I mean, I've mentioned the New York Times, who is kind
your
of
favorite. Your favorite.
My favorite.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that. I mean, I read the articles by what was his name? I mean, there was like this Andrew Roth, for example. And then their Moscow correspondent who spent a lot of time there and who broke really, stories, I believe, on the ground, being on the ground. Yeah. But also my colleagues from German papers, like there is this Christian Esch, you probably don't know him, he writes for Berliner Zeitung. He also did some stories from the separatist territories, but also from the other side. So, yeah. My colleague from the German radio, Florian Kellermann. I would have to think if you really want to hear more names, but there are people. And was there a second question? No.
And actually, you mentioned Pavel Konygin, and he also is a subject to big controversy in Ukraine because of the photo he made with Borodai. And again, it means that it's really very difficult to be really in the middle or above the situation. And for example, one of my points is that because of many Western journalists been trying to be super neutral on Crimea and not being kind of finger pointing on who is kind of operating on the ground, so it delayed the time for very important decision-making process kind of on evaluating the whole process, and that enabled war in Donbass, because the journalists would start calling kind of a spade from the very beginning and saying this is the Russian annexation happening in Crimea, and that would go from kind of media discourse to political discourse and would go to decision makers, because the decision makers are not concerned as soon as media are not concerned. So is media been calling them just nice green man or green man, you know? And I mean, most of them privately told to me that, of course, we know that they are Russian military operating, but as soon as we don't have formal signs like in Syria, so we cannot call it because it's just, you know, our feelings. We need to do a fact checking, have two sides, you know, and as soon as we cannot prove it from the Russian side, so that's not true. And it was just delaying the process, and that basically brought in the war in Donbass. That's my personal point of
But do
view.
you think that the Western journalists played such a big role in this?
Yes, exactly,
decision-making
because their
process?
governments are reading their own newspapers and news agencies, and as soon as it was not kind of taken as a official line, you know, that was not a right moment for decision makers in their own respective countries to think in terms like this. So it was just a total uncertainty, and journalists were kind of bringing their own uncertainty into this, and politicians were just waiting, because if there is no pressure from kind of bottom to up, you know, they don't need to come up with any decisions on be more decisive in calling these things in the right way. I mean, they started protesting only that it was already fait accompli, you know, it just was already there. So I thought, well, how would you comment on this? Am I right now?
I don't know, actually, I mean, I was there in Crimea when this happened. I saw these soldiers coming out of their trucks and taking position in front of the Ukrainian army quarters. And there were many reporters there. I think, yes, everyone was in a way surprised what is happening here. I mean, this is what everybody was asking themselves, I think, because it was such an unprecedented situation, and to me it seems like there is like somebody, I mean, it looked like as if there is somebody coming from the Martians, you know, out of nowhere. Actually, I mean, I don't know, maybe I wouldn't fully agree because I want to defend my own work now. I think I tried at least to depict as thoroughly as possible what I was seeing, and the problem was that they wouldn't talk with you, of course. They would, I mean, the soldiers on the spot, but still from what was happening, from, you know, adding one to one, you could kind of see what is happening. And
but no one wrote it. No one called it an invasion. You just said soldiers. Soldiers, you know, not Ukrainian soldiers, Martian soldiers, which were then called little green men. Nobody called it an invasion.
They cannot hear you.
I'm sorry, I know.
So
Give
it's
me a
great
microphone.
that you came up with this metaphor of Martians, because that's exactly the words I am using when talking to my kind of foreign colleagues and describing, so where do you think the soldiers came from? From Mars or from Ecuador or any other kind of, I mean, you can do a guesswork, and I mean, guesswork is not the best fact-checking instrument usually, but as you mentioned, it was kind of unusual situation, because I've been talking to many diplomats, and they said, okay, we just didn't have any people on the ground in Crimea, so we couldn't assess this as a kind of from our side, this information, so we've been relying on media a lot on decision making. That's what I hear kind of from diplomatic side.
How about Western intelligence?
Yeah.
Was it a complete failure?
Yeah, it was a failure, they recognized it, because I mean, they were not in Crimea because they just didn't get there. You mentioned moratoriums, so if I might usurpate another question. So, and yesterday you mentioned interesting things that you basically do not care much about if they publish or not from your personal perspective, because I mean, this is just weird, but you do not feel kind of threatened by this, or do you?
Yeah, me personally not, because I mean, for two reasons mainly, because until now nobody has threatened me, you know, I mean, this is just, I was waiting after this happened, like 10 days ago. I was kind of course, a bit, maybe not shocked, but I was like, oh my God, I'm also on this list, so let's see what's happening, but nothing happened. Plus, I'm not in Ukraine at the moment also. So I think this also contributed to the feeling that I personally am not so much under threat. If there is somebody, and I think it mostly concerns really Ukrainian nationals themselves, probably those who, yes, of course, who went there, but also, I mean, there are people on the list from Donetsk who work like as stringers and who still kind of commute between the two sides, and I think for them this means much more pressure and also insecurity. And I mean, being on the list with more than 4,000 or 5,000, because they renewed the list now yesterday. They put a new kind of edition of the version of the list online, and there's even more. So the first list, it was like from 2014 to 15, and now it's going up to 2016. So I'm clearly not the most, you know, prominent member of this list. I mean, I've had, of course, people calling me and writing emails, and in a way I'm used to this, not threats, but yeah, how could I say, very impolite criticism of people. So yeah, and maybe other nationals or in other countries are more exposed, but I think Austria is maybe also a kind of special case.
Yeah, but actually,
as it is more in our public also, for example, it is very much accepted that we report from both sides, and in other countries and of course in Ukraine, which is yet another category, it is not so much accepted. So.
Thank you for your presentation. I have the question connected with the past. As far as we know, at least one country has unpredictable past. But you know, 80 years ago there was Austrian Anschluss. I mean, it was prohibited by Geneva Declarations in 1922, but despite that, there was a German Spring. We were suffering 2 years ago from Russian Spring, and there was a German one in the year 1938. And just imagine that only part of Austria voted Ja for this Third Reich. And is it possible for you personally to be a journalist covering the information on Anschluss from Bundestag and showing something like this bulletin with the name of Adolf Hitler near the version of the answer yes, ja, and the small one is nein.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this situation in Ukraine, connected with journalists working with DNR, LNR, and so on and so on. Do you think, is it possible that sometimes journalists are trying to hide their own awkwardness with standards? Thank you.
Well, it's difficult for me to comment on this on the historic
Just
parallel.
imagine.
Yeah. Okay.
Personally for you, you're Austrian.
Yeah. I will think about it.
any other questions?
У мене короткий коментар запитання, Євген, до тебе спершу. Я думаю, що провина не лише західних журналістів, вони на другому місці, так, це ситуація по Криму. А перша провина у роботі західних спецслужб, які вже точно знали, звідки зелені чоловічі кіно через супутникові системи і так далі, які мали би одразу надати цю інформацію тим же австрійським журналістам, я не знаю, інших країн, але чому вони не надали? І от у мене питання в зв'язку з цим до нашої спікерки. Як розвідка австрійська співпрацювала в той час з журналістами, допомагала розібратися, якщо справді виникало таке питання, звідки чоловічики чи зелені. Я думаю, насправді всі розуміли, але бракувало доказів. То чому силовики, розвідка не надала ці докази своїй же пресі?
I think you're overestimating the Austrian security services. I can't really answer this question because I'm not in touch with them, and nobody has ever reached out to me from Austrian security services providing information. I mean, now going back and thinking back myself into this, huh?
And you?
To ask, no, frankly, no. I didn't ask them. No. But yeah. No, but I mean, what I remember now is there was information available, and what we also published back then in articles was like the special information that was made available by military specialists, of course, who would look at all these, the soldiers and the vehicles and the signs and try to detect where they would come from, and actually they could attribute some of them to, Russian special forces. So this might not have happened on the first day, but I believe 2 or 3 days later we had such information was made available, and that this is what we also used as a proof. But with the intelligence services, no, I'm sorry, I can't answer this question.
Jutta, thank you so much for your brilliant insights and reflections from the practical point of view and from your previous experience. I would like to make some comments. First of all, you mentioned my presentation yesterday. I was not doubting in foreign experience of war reporting done by the citizens of the particular country where is the conflict. It could be very valuable for us to study more deeply the practices from different countries, from Balkan countries, from Israel-Palestine conflict. The main problem is what should be done by journalists who is the citizen of particular country. Because for international media outlets, for international journalists, for foreign journalists, it's much more easier situation. You are coming to the conflict zone and describing, covering this from the both sides and so on. So I think maybe it would be great to organize something like international conferences on this topic to learn lessons from the experience of other countries. As for the meritorious situation, as for me, from my personal perspective, the main discussion is going around the problem of not covering both sides of territories of the conflict, but the very issue of relations of Ukrainian journalists with the administration of terroristic organizations. So the very fact of relations is very disputable and troubling for Ukrainian community. And as for your comments that you think that the freedom of speech is under threat now in Ukraine, my personal perspective that it's not so problematic situation now. We have some issues to be discussed, we have some scandals and so on, but the systematic situation, there is no huge ground for such threats, I think so. Maybe my colleagues will disagree with me, but it's not so great problems with this. And also, thank you so much for your proposals for new topics. The conflict analysis is crucial in media coverage of the conflict, because we need to stakeholder analysis, we need the analysis of the military issues, pros and cons, and the so-called war audit to be done. And naturally that we need to focus on the humanitarian angle and to report more thoroughly on the consequences of conflict, of the looking for the common ground for the future with these territories, with the citizens, and with the future Russia also. And my questions quite brief. You mentioned in the beginning that a lot of reporting made by Austrian media and also Western media in general was from Moscow. Do you see any problem that there are a lot of press offices of Western media are located in Moscow and they are not moving to Kiev, and they have some Russian glasses in perspective on perspective and their vision on the whole territory of post-Soviet area and Ukraine in particular?
Yeah, thanks for this question. Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, as you said, Moscow is kind of the traditional place where the post-Soviet territory or the former post-Soviet sphere is being covered from. So also Austrian media and German media covered, I mean, they sent their correspondents from Moscow to Ukraine. This happened, but not in every case, but there is a quite substantial number of correspondents who flew in from Moscow. So yes, you got it right. Also some from Warsaw, I think, and now if we talk about German-speaking media in general, and some from Berlin or Vienna if they don't have correspondents in the region stationed. I think unfortunately it is not very realistic to hope that media outlets will open bureaus in Kiev. I mean, of course they should. They should open bureaus in, I don't know, in Kiev and in other cities, as many as possible, to cover conflicts from the spot and from the capital, which is closest by. But however, I think this is not a very this won't happen soon in times of economic crisis of the media. And actually, what media outlets are doing, they're even closing down their Moscow offices. So things get more and more centralized, and that's actually the development in Central or Western Europe. So I think yes, you might be right that if you have been a correspondent in Moscow for a very long time, that this might influence your viewpoint on things, because it's just, the people you talk to, the sources you have available. But ultimately, I think it depends really on yourself and way of thinking. So there might be different outcomes. Yeah, I wouldn't say that Moscow is to blame when a correspondent writes bullshit. He himself is to blame. Yeah, but
Okay, as I'm signaled that we need to wrap up before lunch, so I would almost finished here, but my very last question would be about the book you published, which is called Ukraine in the War. So what's this book about, and do you plan to translate it here and publish in Ukraine? Or so what's the book?
Yeah, I published this book in January in Austria. I'm not planning to translate it into neither, I don't know, English or Ukrainian, because actually many parts of the book are already outdated. So because there is so much happening in Ukraine, you cannot really keep up with events. And also the second point is, of course, that I think this book is not really aimed at an Ukrainian audience, and you know things much better than I do. Or I mean, the audience here knows much more. I think they don't need such a kind of general view from the foreign reporter. But it's really aimed at the German-speaking audience. And I think it has like mainly two aims, or that the structure of the book is as such that I'm giving a kind of summary on the events that took place, and there's also feature stories in the book. So it's kind of twofold. One of the reasons why I did it is, well, it was my idea kind of to explain to the Austrian or German audience what happened in Ukraine. Also trying to present a different view and not this propagandist view that we are kind of dealing with very much in Austria. And then try to describe the situation of really people on the ground. So it also deals a lot with humanitarian issues and situation of IDPs, but not in a general way. I'm rather really focusing on individuals and telling their stories. So it's an attempt also of this kind of realizing this storytelling approach. And, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I know there are many other questions left, but I would advise to keep them for the panel discussion we will have at the end of it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.